Space is vast, unforgiving, unrelenting, and utterly silent. It's not just a void, but a graveyard of ambition, dreams, and the desperate hopes of humanity trying to carve out an existence in the cold vacuum. Ships vanish all the time, swallowed by the endless darkness, never to be seen again. And sometimes those ships take more than just their crew. They take secrets, horrors, and questions no one is ever prepared to answer. It started with a rumor, the kind that floats around the far reaches of colonized space, whispered in bars and traded among scavengers like contraband. They called it the Erebus. The name alone was enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone who'd heard it. A colony ship launched 1,000 years ago, a titan of its time, designed to carry a generation of pioneers to a distant star. But the Erebus never made it. Official records said the ship suffered a catastrophic failure and was presumed lost. But here's the thing. In space, nothing just disappears. Every wreck leaves a trail, every signal a faint echo. And someone claimed to have found it. Crazy, right? But it gets weirder. The coordinates came to us through an encrypted signal, bouncing through relays like a ghost. 1,000 years of silence, and then suddenly, this. The message was garbled, distorted by time and radiation, but the intent was clear. Help us. You'd think that would be enough to make us turn back, wouldn't you? But out here, curiosity kills faster than vacuum exposure. And if there's one thing scavengers like us can't resist, it's the promise of untouched tech from an era long past. Our ship, the Vanguard Eclipse, wasn't much. A patched-together relic of better times. But it was sturdy, and it had a crew desperate enough to chase the ghost of a 1,000-year-old colony ship into the Black Drift. There was Captain Juno, a battle-scarred veteran with a cybernetic eye and a knack for surviving the impossible. Malik, our engineer, whose hands were as quick with a spanner as they were with a plasma rifle. And then there was me, Lena, the one stupid enough to think we might actually find something out there worth the risk. The coordinates led us to the edges of map space, a region so remote even the corporate beacons gave up trying to maintain a signal. Out there, the void feels different, heavier, as if the darkness itself is alive and watching. It wasn't long before we saw it, the Erebus. It loomed ahead like a ghost from another era, its massive hull pockmarked and scarred by centuries adrift. The ship was a monolith of dark metal, its design ancient yet eerily timeless. No lights, no signals, just a dead hulk floating in the abyss. But as we approached, our proximity scanners went wild, picking up faint energy readings from deep within. "Still think this is just a salvage job?" Malik muttered, his voice crackling over comms. Captain Juno grunted. "We didn't come all this way to turn back now. Strap in. We're boarding." Sounds reckless, doesn't it? But out here, reckless is the norm. We docked at what used to be the main airlock. The doors were frozen shut, sealed by centuries of ice. Malik rigged a plasma cutter to burn through the layers, the glow of molten metal casting eerie shadows against the Erebus's hull. The airlock hissed open with a groan, like a beast waking from a long slumber. Inside, the cold hit us like a physical force. Even with our suit's thermal systems, the chill bit through, a reminder that this ship had been dead for centuries. But as we stepped into the dim corridors, something felt off. The walls were coated in frost, and the air was thick with a metallic tang, like blood left too long in the sun. Our footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence. But the strangest thing? The lights. Here and there, faint flickers of power pulsed through the ship, like a dying heartbeat refusing to stop. Panels blinked weakly, casting brief, cold light onto the frost-covered walls. It wasn't enough to see clearly, but just enough to remind us that this ship wasn't entirely dead. "How is there still power after 1,000 years?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's not the real question," Juno replied. "The real question is, why does it feel like someone's been here the whole time?" And she wasn't wrong. We found signs of life, or what used to be life. Half-melted food rations, tools abandoned mid-repair, a child's toy, its edges worn smooth from use. But no bodies, not one. "Where is everyone?" Malik muttered, his grip tightening on his plasma cutter. That's when we heard it. A faint sound, almost too quiet to notice, like the whisper of wind through the corridors. Except there was no wind, no atmosphere to carry sound, and yet it was there, threading through the silence like a living thing. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. Juno nodded, her cybernetic eye glowing faintly as she scanned the darkness ahead. "Stay close. Whatever this is, we're not alone." We followed the sound deeper into the ship, through twisting corridors and frost-covered chambers. The energy readings grew stronger, spiking in erratic bursts that made our scanners glitch. And then we found the first room, a cryopod chamber, rows upon rows of them, each one clouded with frost, their inhabitants frozen in time. Most were dark, their systems long since failed, but a few still flickered with faint power, their occupants suspended in an uneasy stasis. "These people, they never made it to the colony," Malik whispered, his breath fogging his visor. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room was a terminal, its screen cracked but still functioning. Juno activated it, and a flood of data scrolled across the screen. Logs, schematics, and warnings. "Quarantine breach detected. Containment protocols active. Do not attempt evacuation." "Quarantine?" I echoed, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. Malik pointed to a line of text flashing red at the bottom of the screen. "Experiment number 47, active status, unknown parameters." "Experiment?" Juno's voice was tight. What the hell were they doing on this ship? None of us had an answer, but before we could dig deeper, the whispering sound returned. Louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't just noise, it was voices, hundreds of them, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of despair. "Is it the crew?" Malik asked, his face pale. "No," Juno said grimly, her hand tightening on her sidearm. "It's something else." And she was right, because as we turned to leave the cryopod chamber, the lights flickered violently, and a shadow moved at the edge of my vision. Not a shadow cast by us, but something alive, shifting, watching. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you see that?" Juno didn't answer. She was already moving, her weapon drawn, her eyes scanning the darkness. Malik swore under his breath, backing toward the door. "Whatever this is," Juno said, her voice low and steady, "it's been waiting for us. Seems like enough to send us running, doesn't it?" But we weren't ready for what came next. The corridor outside the cryopod chamber wasn't empty anymore. Shadows pooled unnaturally, coalescing into forms that defied logic. Limbs stretched too long, faces featureless but hauntingly human, and the whispering, it wasn't just noise, it was words. "You shouldn't have come," the voices said, overlapping in a discordant chorus. But we had, and now there was no turning back. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows surged forward. We stumbled back into the cryopod chamber, our breaths ragged as the things closed in. The frost-covered walls seemed to shimmer in the faint light of our lamps, throwing jagged reflections of the horrors creeping toward us. "They're not stopping," Malik hissed, his plasma cutter shaking in his hands. "Hold the door," Juno barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Malik, get it sealed, now!" But the door's control panel was dark, dead from centuries of neglect. Malik cursed under his breath, fumbling for his tools as the whispers grew louder, the sound worming its way into my skull. "You can't escape," the voices said, layered and fragmented, like hundreds of mouths speaking in unison. One of the shadows lunged, its elongated arm slashing toward us. Juno fired her sidearm, the plasma bolt slicing through the thing's arm, which evaporated into black mist. But the limb reformed almost instantly, snapping back into place as if taunting us. "We need to go," Malik shouted, his fingers flying over the panel. "This isn't working." "You don't say." Juno fired again, driving the shadows back long enough for Malik to bypass the lock. The door hissed shut behind us with a screech of ancient hydraulics, sealing the things on the other side. For now. We backed away from the door, our lamps flickering as the whispers faded into the distance. My heart was hammering, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get off this ship and never look back. "Anyone else care to explain what the hell those things are?" Malik asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound angry. Juno shook her head, her gaze fixed on the door. "I don't know, but they're not natural, not human." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "They knew we were here. They talked to us." "Yeah," Malik said, his voice rising in pitch. "They also tried to kill us. Can we focus on that?" "Shut it, both of you," Juno snapped. "We're not safe yet." She was right. The ship was ancient, falling apart at the seams, but there was something alive here. Something that had been waiting. And the further we went, the clearer it became that the Erebus was far more than just a lost colony ship. The corridors were colder now, frost creeping over every surface like veins of ice. The faint energy readings on Juno's scanner pulsed irregularly, leading us deeper into the heart of the ship. Every step felt like a descent, as if the Erebus itself were swallowing us whole. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the ship's ancient hull. None of us spoke, the tension between us as sharp as the frost-crusted air. "How far does this thing go?" Malik muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Farther than it should," Juno replied grimly. "Stay focused." Ahead of us, the corridor opened into a massive atrium. The ceiling stretched high above, its surface obscured by layers of frost and darkness. In the center of the room stood a towering structure, a massive cylindrical core, its surface covered in faintly glowing symbols. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my voice tinged with awe and unease. Juno approached cautiously, her weapon at the ready. "Looks like some kind of power source, but it's wrong." "Wrong how?" Malik asked, his curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "Look at it." Juno gestured to the symbols, which seemed to shift and writhe like living things. "That's not standard tech, not even close." Malik frowned, stepping closer to inspect the core. His scanner beeped faintly, the readings erratic. "It's ancient, pre-colony, maybe even pre-human, but it's still active." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. If this isn't human tech, then who built it? Juno didn't answer. She was too busy studying the markings, her cybernetic eye glowing faintly as it analyzed the strange designs. The longer I stared, the more the symbols seemed to pulse, almost like they were alive. Guys," Malik said, his voice trembling. "I think we've got company." I turned just in time to see the shadows pooling in the corners of the atrium, coalescing into the same twisted forms we'd seen before. But this time, there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, their faceless heads tilting in unison as they stepped toward us. "You shouldn't be here," the voices said again, louder now, filling the room like a storm. Juno raised her weapon, but before she could fire, the core behind us flared to life. The glowing symbols burned brighter, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. The shadows froze, their forms flickering as if caught in a static field. "What's happening?" Malik asked, shielding his eyes from the light. "I don't know," Juno shouted over the rising hum, "but I don't think it's good." The core's light intensified, and suddenly a beam of energy shot out, striking the ground in front of us. The floor split open with a deafening crack, revealing a hidden chamber below. "Move!" Juno yelled, grabbing my arm as the ground beneath us gave way. We fell, tumbling into the darkness below as the shadows screamed in rage. We landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Malik groaned beside me, clutching his side as he struggled to sit up. Juno was already on her feet, scanning the room with her weapon raised. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with more of the strange symbols. In the center was a massive spherical object, its surface smooth and black as obsidian. It pulsed faintly, the light within shifting like liquid fire. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Juno didn't answer. She was too busy studying the object, her expression a mix of awe and fear. Malik managed to get to his feet, his scanner beeping wildly as he approached the sphere. "It's alive," he said, his voice trembling. "Or something close to it. The energy readings are off the charts." Before anyone could respond, the sphere flared to life, and a voice echoed through the chamber. Not the fragmented whispers of the shadows, but a single, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You were not meant to find this place," it said, cold and emotionless. I froze, my heart pounding, as the voice continued. "The Erebus was not lost. It was abandoned for good reason. You must leave." "And if we don't?" Juno asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The sphere pulsed again, and the symbols on the walls began to shift, forming strange, incomprehensible patterns. The air grew heavier, the temperature plummeting as the voice responded. "Then you will face the same fate as they did." Before we could ask what it meant, the chamber shook violently, and the shadows began to seep through the cracks in the walls. "Run!" Juno shouted, pulling me to my feet. We bolted for the nearest exit, the shadows closing in behind us. The ship groaned under the strain, the walls cracking and splintering as we raced through the corridors. But even as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only going deeper into the nightmare. Every step was a race against the ever-expanding darkness that seemed to grow with every breath. "Faster!" Juno shouted, her voice cutting through the pounding in my ears. The harsh echoes of our boots slamming against the frost-coated floor seemed to reverberate through the entire ship, as if the walls were closing in around us. Behind us, the shadows slithered closer, their grotesque shapes growing longer and more distorted as they merged into one seamless mass of darkness. It was as if the very essence of the ship itself was feeding on our fear, amplifying it. The things chasing us weren't just mindless phantoms. They were intelligent, purposeful, and relentless. We rounded a corner, but the path ahead was blocked by a wall of ice that had formed in seconds, its surface alive with dark veins of energy, pulsing with an eerie glow. The icy barrier wasn't just an obstacle, it felt like a barrier between us and something much worse. There was no way forward, no escape. "What the hell?" Malik gasped, slamming his fist against the frozen wall. "We need to get out of here now." His voice cracked, the tension and fear in his words thickening the air around us. Juno cursed under her breath, her weapon raised, scanning the area. This ship wasn't just lost, it's been waiting for us. "We're not the first to stumble into this hell." "What do you mean, waiting for us?" I asked, my breath shallow from the sprint, my chest tight. Juno's eyes were wide with fear as she studied the frozen wall. Her cybernetic eye hummed to life, flashing with diagnostics, and her lips trembled. "I don't know, but whatever happened to the crew, it's still here, and it's hunting us." Before we could even process her words, the ship shook violently. It felt like an explosion, the entire structure groaning under the weight of an unseen force. The icy barrier trembled as the pulse of energy from the shadows pressed against it, seeking a way in. The light from our lamps flickered and then died. In the dark, the whispers began again, low, guttural, full of malice. "You shouldn't be here." The voices were everywhere, surrounding us, filling the air with a suffocating pressure. They weren't just words, they were a presence, alive and malevolent, pushing into our minds, burrowing into the corners of our thoughts. "Get back!" Juno yelled, raising her plasma cutter. The sharp hiss of the weapon charging echoed through the dark. "This thing's alive. It is the thing we're running from." The walls around us trembled again, and for a brief moment, the pulse of energy from the shadows seemed to shift. The mass of darkness that had been chasing us now seemed to pull away, retreating like the tide. As it receded, we could hear something else, scraping, dragging, echoing from deep within the ship, a monstrous metallic sound. "That's not just the ship," Malik whispered, eyes wide. "Something else is in here with us." And then we saw it. The shadow, tall and elongated, moved toward us with terrifying precision. It was no longer a disjointed mass, but a singular, solid presence. A figure towering and impossibly thin, yet somehow humanoid. Its outline was shrouded in darkness, but its movements were deliberate, calculated, and suffused with an unnatural grace. We took a step back, eyes locked on it. A low, rumbling voice echoed from the thing, sending chills through my entire body. "You shouldn't have come." And that's when it struck. With a speed I couldn't comprehend, the figure lunged, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, reaching out like a predator, faster than I could react. I felt the air shift as it passed by me, the coldness of its presence sending a shock down my spine. Juno fired, once, twice. The plasma shots hit the thing, but it didn't flinch, didn't recoil. The energy just seemed to dissipate into the blackness, absorbed by its form. "Fall back!" Juno shouted, already pulling me away from the thing. Malik scrambled to keep up, his eyes wide with fear. The figure's voice echoed in the dark, a rasping hiss. "Escape is futile." I couldn't argue with it. Our footsteps quickened as we raced for the nearest exit, which seemed to shift as the ship itself twisted and turned. There was no straight path anymore. Everything was a labyrinth of corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The walls pulsed, the shadows growing thicker the further we went. "This place is a nightmare," Malik said, panting hard, his voice high-pitched from fear. "What happened to the crew? What the hell are we even dealing with?" Juno's answer was grim, her eyes scanning the twisting passage ahead. "We're dealing with something ancient, something not even the original inhabitants understood. This ship, it's more than just lost. It's a tomb. It's been waiting for us to wake it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Waiting for us. The idea that this wasn't just a random occurrence, that whatever was hunting us had been prepared, set in motion long before we even arrived. It made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the ship lurched again, throwing us all off balance. A sound like grinding metal pierced the air as the walls began to close in on us. The floor beneath us cracked, splintering apart as if the ship itself was breaking apart. "Keep going!" Juno yelled. Her voice was strained, urgent. "We can't stay here." We scrambled forward, barely making it past a narrow passage as the floor gave way behind us, spilling into the void. The shadows were close now, right on our heels, the air growing thick with their oppressive presence. But something else was growing too. A whisper. Low, guttural, like it was coming from the ship's very bones. "You shouldn't be here." I felt it crawling over my skin, crawling through my thoughts. A presence that wasn't just hunting us but controlling the ship itself. The cold, alien nature of it was suffocating. "Almost there," Juno muttered through clenched teeth, eyes fixed on the next door, the final barrier between us and whatever lay beyond. She shoved past Malik and grabbed the handle, but just as her hand touched it, the lights flickered again. This time, the room plunged into darkness. I could hear it now, the sound of movement in the dark, the scraping of something large and powerful. Before Juno could react, the ship's mechanical systems groaned, and the walls came alive, shifting around us. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, trapping us in the heart of the ship's labyrinth. And then, the voice came again, closer now, louder than ever. "You cannot escape." In the pitch-black void of the chamber, with no escape in sight, the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing. But we weren't alone, and it knew we were there. The air around us seemed to hum with an oppressive, malevolent energy. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light, it felt like a tangible presence, pressing down on us from all sides. Every breath I took tasted metallic, heavy, as though the very air was thick with the residue of something ancient and wrong. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached out, desperate to grab something solid, but my hands met nothing but the cold, unyielding air. The ground beneath me felt unstable, like it could crumble away at any moment. I stumbled back, nearly falling, my pulse racing. I couldn't see anything. The shadows around us were absolute, impenetrable, suffocating. Yet I could feel it. Something was moving in the dark, brushing against the edges of my awareness. It was watching us, its presence a weight pressing down on the back of my neck. "Juno," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper in the thick silence. "What the hell is this?" Juno's voice was tight, barely audible. "The core, it's reacting to us. Whatever it is, it's alive. It knows we're here." A sudden, sharp noise cut through the air, a hiss followed by a series of rapid clicks. It came from all directions at once, as though the very walls of the chamber had come alive. I spun around, but there was nothing. The shadows were thick, impenetrable, and then a low, guttural growl rumbled from the depths of the darkness. It wasn't the same as before. This was deeper, more primal, like the sound of something ancient awakening from a long slumber. "Malik," Juno whispered urgently, "stay close." But before any of us could move, the ground trembled beneath us, shaking violently. The rumbling intensified, as though the very foundation of the ship was being torn apart. A flash of light, brief and blinding, illuminated the chamber for an instant, and in that fleeting moment, I saw it. It wasn't a creature, not in the way we understood creatures. It was something much worse. It was like a being, woven from the darkness itself, twisting and undulating in shapes that defied nature. Its form was ever-shifting, constantly reforming itself, as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its presence filled the space, vast and unknowable, a nightmare made real. I could feel its eyes on me. It was as if it was studying us, waiting. Juno cursed under her breath. "It's the core, the ship. It's feeding off us, off our fear." The growl grew louder, closer. I could hear the scraping of claws against metal, the shuffling of movement, the sound of something far larger than anything human, or even animal, should have been. It was coming for us. I forced my legs to move, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We couldn't stay here, but I didn't know where to run. There was nowhere to go. The chamber was a void, an endless expanse of darkness. The walls were indistinct, stretching impossibly high, as if the very space itself was bending around us. Then I heard it, a voice low and warped, whispering from the darkness. "You think you can escape? You think you can stop it?" I froze. The voice didn't come from any one direction. It was everywhere, a chorus of whispers, each voice overlapping the next, until they blended into one maddening cacophony. My mind reeled, unable to process the sound. It felt like it was seeping into my very thoughts, twisting my reality. I turned toward Juno, my voice shaking. "Juno, what the hell is that?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were wide, staring into the darkness, her face pale with terror. And then I understood. The voices weren't just whispering to us. They were whispering to her. Her hands trembled at her sides, and she took a step forward, her gaze locked on something I couldn't see. It's not just the ship. It's the core. It's been waiting for us." Her voice cracked, almost breaking. "It's not just an engine. It's a prison. It's keeping something locked away. And now we've released it." "What?" Malik's voice was hoarse. "Released what?" The growl came again, louder this time, and this time I could hear the faint scraping of something massive dragging itself toward us. I could feel it getting closer, closer until the air was thick with the scent of decay, like death itself was crawling toward us. I turned, frantically searching for an escape, but all I saw was the shifting dark. I was trapped. We were all trapped. Then something shifted in the shadows. A figure, large, towering, stepped out from the darkness. It wasn't a person, not entirely. Its form was almost humanoid, but its skin was a patchwork of shadows and light, rippling like a mirage. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face was barely a face at all. Just a mass of black, swirling void, with two glaring holes. No, not holes, just voids in the fabric of the universe, endless and consuming. It spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You are too late." I felt a chill run through me, deeper than the cold of the ship, deeper than anything I had ever known. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey, frozen in place by the weight of its gaze. "You released me," the creature rasped, "and now you will join me in my prison, forever." The chamber seemed to contract around us, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker, thicker, as though the ship itself was trying to consume us. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, rising in a frenzy, merging with the growl of the creature, until it was one unholy sound, a screaming tide of madness that crashed through my mind. And then, all at once, the shadows surged forward, engulfing us. My vision blurred and my mind screamed for release, but it was too late. The last thing I heard was the creature's voice, a mocking, triumphant whisper in the dark. "You're mine." The next moment was a whirlwind of confusion, cold, unnatural, suffocating. I was pulled in all directions at once, unable to focus on any one thing. A sharp pain shot through my skull, as though the darkness itself was burrowing into my brain. I gasped, struggling to break free, but my body felt heavy, like it was being dragged down by invisible chains. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The darkness lifted, but not the weight. The air still felt thick and oppressive, and the sensation of being watched never left me. I blinked, trying to adjust to my surroundings, but everything was distorted. The walls seemed to warp in and out of focus, flickering like a bad transmission. Nothing felt real. The floor beneath my feet felt too soft, like I was walking on something that wasn't solid. "Malik?" Juno's voice cut through the haze, sounding distant, like she was speaking from miles away. "Juno?" I called, panic creeping into my voice. Where are you?" But the words didn't come out right. They were garbled, jumbled, as though the very fabric of reality was breaking down around me. My heart raced, my breathing shallow. What was happening? Where was I? Where were they? The flickering continued, and then, in an instant, everything snapped back into focus. I found myself standing in a vast open space, a wide empty room. Or was it? It felt like I was somewhere between worlds. The space around me was enormous, stretching infinitely in every direction. But there was nothing there. No landmarks, no details to anchor me. And then I saw it. The ship. No, not the ship as we knew it, but a vision of it, stretching far and wide, fragmented and twisted, like a broken puzzle with pieces floating in midair, shifting, rotating. The ship's hull was cracked, as if the darkness itself had torn it apart. I could see the core pulsing at the center of it all, a swirling mass of black tendrils and light, twisting like an ancient living organism. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Something was pulling me toward it, and that's when I felt it. The thing that had been following us, watching us, waiting for this moment. It was standing in the center of the room. The figure was there again, its presence both a blur and a solid shape at once. It was like a mirage, shifting, constantly reconfiguring itself, its outline broken and incomplete. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that pulled at the edges of my mind, drawing me in. Its form was human-like, but distorted, monstrous, like something that shouldn't exist in our world, but did. "Welcome," the voice echoed. Not from any one direction, but from every corner of the room. It was deep, resonant, carrying 1,000 different tones at once. "You've crossed the threshold." I tried to speak, but my words were lost in my throat. Fear locked my muscles in place, and my chest tightened as I realized that whatever was happening, whatever this place was, I wasn't in control anymore. We weren't. "Do you understand what you've done?" the figure continued, its voice almost a whisper now, but the sound felt like it was coming from inside my skull, pressing against my thoughts. "You think you've escaped the ship's grasp? You think you've broken free?" I swallowed, my throat dry, but my thoughts were clearer now. We hadn't escaped, not by a long shot. This wasn't some trick of the ship. This was something else, something more ancient, more powerful than anything we had ever encountered. "We didn't know," I said, my voice hoarse, struggling to find the words. "We didn't know what we were releasing." The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. It seemed to study me, its hollow eyes piercing through my soul. "You didn't need to know," it said, its voice full of amusement. "But now you do." I could feel it, its power, its presence pressing down on me like an unbearable weight. It was everywhere, inside me, all around me. And then something strange happened, a flicker in the air, like a glitch in reality itself, and I felt wrong, like I was no longer fully human. Something in the room was changing me, altering my very essence. My hands shook, my heart raced, and I could feel the pulse of something dark, something primal, stirring within me. "Let them go!" Juno's voice finally broke through the fog, and I turned toward her, desperate for her presence. "They're not a part of this. You—" But the figure interrupted her with a low, guttural laugh. "You think you can bargain with me?" I felt it then. The change. It was happening to all of us. Juno, Malik. They were standing next to me, but they didn't look the same. Their eyes were empty, hollow, and their movements were jerky, mechanical, like puppets on strings. "You will all become part of me," the figure whispered, its voice trembling with a dark promise. "You're already too far gone." I reached out to Juno, but she stepped back, her face twisted in confusion and fear. "Malik, what's happening to us?" Her voice cracked, and I saw the doubt, the panic in her eyes. The ship's pulse intensified. The floor beneath us seemed to shudder, as though it was alive, breathing. The walls began to ripple, their surface warping, melting, like the very space around us couldn't hold together. The dark core in the distance pulsed harder, sending waves of nauseating energy throughout the room. "Listen," I rasped, trying to steady myself, trying to reach them before it was too late. "We have to fight it, But the darkness surged again, violently this time, and the air grew thick with static, distorting everything around us. I could feel myself being pulled toward the center, pulled toward the core of this nightmare. The others, I couldn't even see them anymore. They were gone. The only thing left was the figure, its gaze never leaving me, its presence dominating the room like a dark sun, suffocating everything in its path. "You're mine," it whispered again, but this time I heard something more. A command. And just like that, everything went black. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no sensation. It was as though I had been swallowed by the abyss. My very existence erased. And then, without warning, I was pulled back into myself. Not gently, not with care, but with a violent force that tore through my consciousness. I gasped, struggling for breath as reality snapped back into place. I was somewhere else. The familiar, twisted corridors of the ship were gone, replaced by an expansive, cold chamber. The walls were smooth, metallic, and seemed to pulse faintly, as though they were alive, breathing. The air smelled stale, thick with decay, and my mind reeled as I tried to make sense of the impossible. Was this another part of the ship? Or had we somehow crossed into a different realm entirely? A low hum vibrated through the room, deep and resonant, making the air feel heavy. I stood unsteady at first, my body trembling as if it had been through some kind of extreme trauma. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I realized that I was not alone. There were figures in the shadows, barely visible, but I could feel their eyes on me. They weren't human. I could tell that much immediately. Their presence was oppressive, like a cloud of smoke that choked the very life out of the air. I strained to see them, but they moved in a way that defied logic, shifting in and out of focus, flickering like shadows cast by a flickering light. Suddenly, the hum stopped. Silence. It was almost worse than the noise. The stillness seemed to press down on me, suffocating and oppressive. And then, a voice, low and guttural, broke through the silence. It was the same voice, the voice of the creature. But this time it was different. It was clearer, stronger. It wasn't just speaking to me anymore. It was speaking through me, filling my head, crawling into my thoughts. "You still don't understand, do you?" it asked, its tone dripping with mockery. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think. My limbs felt heavy, numb, like they didn't belong to me anymore. The darkness around me seemed to close in tighter, curling around my body, wrapping me in a cocoon of despair. The air was colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me, though there was no source of heat anywhere. "All of you," the voice continued, growing louder, "you are all mine now. You belong to me." I could feel the words vibrating through my very bones, shaking me to my core. But this time something inside me snapped, a flicker of defiance, a tiny spark of resistance that had been buried deep within me. "No," I forced the word out, my voice hoarse. ragged. We won't belong to you." The shadows around me stirred, rippling like a disturbed pool of water, but the voice didn't respond right away. Instead, the silence stretched on, growing more intense, until the weight of it was unbearable. My skin crawled, and I felt an icy chill creeping up my spine, but I refused to look away. I had to stand my ground. For a long moment, there was nothing. The shadows had disappeared, leaving only the vast emptiness of the room. And then, just as I thought the nightmare was over, I felt it. A presence. Something different this time. Something colder. It wasn't just a shadow. It was like an entire army of beings, all pressing in on me from all directions. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized that they were all around me, closing in. I could feel them now, their cold, unnatural energy crawling over my skin. But the figure, the creature, wasn't there. Not yet. It was waiting. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, the space shrinking around me. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing against me, choking me. And then I heard a sound, a scrape, followed by a click. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the noise, my mind reeling in panic. There at the far side of the room was a dark shape, shifting in the shadows. For a moment it stood still, watching, waiting, and then it moved, slowly, deliberately. The shape stepped forward, its form flickering in and out of existence, like it was struggling to maintain its shape. My eyes locked on it, and I could feel my heart stop in my chest. The figure that emerged from the darkness wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just the entity that had tormented us from the beginning. This was something worse. It was a part of the ship itself, a fragment of its malevolent will. It was alive, and it was coming for me. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape. But my feet were glued to the ground, my legs unable to move. It was like the very air around me was holding me in place. Closer and closer the figure came, until it was right in front of me. And then I saw it, its eyes. They were not eyes at all, but endless voids, like black holes sucking in everything around them. I could feel them pulling at me, drawing me in, forcing me to look deeper, to fall further into the abyss. But something inside me fought back, something primal, something that had been dormant until now. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grabbed hold of the figure's arm. It was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt before, like ice that had been frozen for eternity. "Let go!" I screamed, but the words were swallowed by the growing hum of the room. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even acknowledge my presence. Instead, its cold, lifeless hands moved toward my chest, its fingers gripping my ribs, its touch freezing my very soul. "You will be mine," it whispered again, its voice sending a wave of agony through my body. "All of you will be mine, forever." I felt the coldness begin to seep through my skin, into my bones, into my heart. My vision blurred, my senses numbing as if I was being consumed from the inside out. I gasped, struggling to hold on, to keep some semblance of my own identity, but it was slipping away, fading, like a dream I couldn't remember. And then, just as I thought I would lose myself completely, a flash of light pierced through the darkness. Bright, blinding. It cut through the shadows, slicing through the room like a blade. The figure recoiled, its grip loosening, and I was thrown backward, crashing into the floor. The light intensified, overwhelming everything, and for a moment I thought I had died, that this was the end. But then the light faded, and I was left in the dim glow of the chamber once again. The figure was gone. The presence had lifted. The room was still, silent. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I pushed myself up from the floor. My body was weak, but I was alive. I was alive. But at what cost? I looked around the room, and that's when I saw it. A door. A door that hadn't been there before. It stood at the far end of the chamber, faintly glowing, as though beckoning me forward. Without thinking, I stumbled toward it, my heart still racing, the terror of what had just happened clawing at my mind. But I knew one thing for certain. The nightmare wasn't over. Whatever had just happened, whatever this place was, it was far from finished. And whatever waited on the other side of that door, I had no doubt that it was waiting for us. And this time, we weren't going to escape. You might think that sounds like the end, right? That somehow we were done, that the nightmare was over. But trust me, it was only just beginning. It's easy to think that a door, some physical barrier, can save you from something like that. But this ship, this thing we were on, it didn't care about doors. It didn't care about any of the usual rules. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was alive. And the darkness that haunted it, it was aware. I wasn't sure if it was the door itself that called us, or if it was just the madness, the fear, driving us forward. But there we were, standing in front of it, staring at something that shouldn't have been there. The door shimmered in a way that made my skin crawl, like it was breathing, like it was alive too. The edges were pulsating, as though it were a membrane between worlds. And when I reached out to touch it, my hand felt a jolt of static, a violent shock, making me yank it back. "Do you really want to open that?" Juno's voice broke through the haze in my mind. She sounded weak, her voice hoarse from whatever we'd just endured. "What's on the other side of that door, Malik?" I didn't know, and I couldn't answer her, because I didn't have a clue. Whatever waited on the other side, it was calling to us, and that was a pull stronger than any question or reason. We couldn't leave it alone. "Does it matter?" I managed to croak out, my throat tight, my mind still clouded from whatever strange energy had taken hold of me. "We don't have a choice." Juno's eyes flickered to the door, and I saw the conflict there. She was scared, terrified, but even she could feel it. The undeniable pull, like gravity. "Malik, we've barely made it this far. We're losing ourselves. Can't you feel it?" Oh, I felt it. The weight of whatever was in the air, the strange vibration in the walls, the way my limbs felt foreign. But at that moment, I didn't care. I couldn't. Not with whatever was out there waiting for us. The door creaked open before I even touched it, as if it had been anticipating our next move. It swung wide, revealing an abyss behind it. The space beyond the door stretched out, a massive void that swallowed the light from our torches and stretched into darkness that seemed to have no end. "Guess we're going in," I said, even though I could barely hear my own voice over the pounding of my heart. We stepped through the threshold, and the air immediately grew colder, the chill biting into my skin. The temperature wasn't just a physical thing. It felt like a presence, an invisible hand wrapping around us, squeezing the warmth from our bones. And as we ventured deeper, the ship, the thing, seemed to shift around us. The walls of the corridor stretched, their smooth surfaces warping and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. The ship was changing. Or maybe we were, but it didn't matter. We couldn't stop moving. Every step felt wrong. The very air felt wrong. We rounded a corner, and that's when we saw them. Figures. Moving figures. Silhouettes. Standing in the distance. But these weren't people. At least not in the way we understood people. They were distorted. Their bodies stretched and bent in ways that no human being could survive. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, were holes, black pits that seemed to devour the light. They weren't just alive, they were waiting. Before I could even react, one of them stepped forward, its movements jerky, mechanical. The air around it distorted, like the creature itself was warping the space. And it spoke. Its voice wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. Deep, resonant, like it was coming from the bowels of the ship itself. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, and its voice vibrated through the walls, making my chest rattle. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. It was too late for warnings. We had already crossed into whatever nightmare awaited us, and there was no going back. But you know what? We didn't have time to dwell on that. It was here, it was happening, and every single part of me was telling me that it wasn't just this creature I should fear. It was the ship. The ship itself, as broken and twisted as it was the true enemy. Before I could form a response, the thing lunged. And I don't know how, but my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I drew a weapon, something, from my side, and I fired without thinking. The shot rang out through the chamber, but it didn't do a damn thing. The creature seemed to absorb the energy, its form rippling like water in response to the attack. I froze, heart sinking. We were in way over our heads. Behind me, I could hear Juno breathing in short, panicked gasps. She wasn't ready for this. None of us were. But this was no longer a choice. This was survival. And the creature, whatever it was, wasn't about to let us leave. We ran, and I mean ran like our lives depended on it. Which, well, they did. The thing didn't chase us, but I could feel it. I could hear it. The ship was closing in on us. It was alive, and it was hunting us. Every corridor, every turn, every door we passed seemed to bend, twist, and shudder in a way that was far from natural. The walls were alive with noise, a cacophony of whispers, like thousands of voices murmuring just below the surface. "Don't stop," I hissed, my voice raw. "Whatever you do, don't stop." But it wasn't just the creature we had to fear. The ship itself was changing, its very fabric unraveling. The energy pulsing around us was growing stronger, and I felt my body pulling apart from the inside. My hands shook, and a cold sweat broke out across my brow. Every inch of this place was wrong, as though we had crossed into some other realm, a realm that was neither dead nor alive, but something in between. We stumbled forward, barely managing to stay on our feet. And then, there it was, the engine room, the heart of the ship, a place we never should have found. It loomed before us, a massive chamber filled with twisting metal and glowing pipes. The air was thick with energy, unnatural, crackling. I could feel the pulse of it, deep within my chest, thrumming through the walls, through the very floor beneath my feet. Juno stood frozen at the entrance. I could see her face pale in the dim light. She was shaking. "Malik, what is this place?" I didn't have time to explain. I couldn't even form a coherent thought, but there was one thing I knew with absolute certainty. This was the source, the core of whatever had been hunting us. The creature, the shadow, the presence. It was a manifestation of the ship's will. The ship itself was alive, and it wasn't going to stop until it had absorbed every last one of us. I turned to Juno, grabbed her arm and yanked her forward. "We have to destroy it, now!" I don't know why I said that. I didn't know if it was even possible. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing that mattered. The ship was feeding on us, and we had to stop it, or we would become part of it, forever. But as we stepped inside the heart of the ship, everything changed. The moment we crossed the threshold into the engine room, a deep rumble vibrated through the air, a low frequency that shook the floor beneath our feet. The air itself seemed to pulse, like something alive was drawing a breath. The walls were covered in pulsating veins, dark, organic-looking tendrils that wriggled like worms beneath the surface of the metal. The entire room felt like the inside of a living organism, and every inch of it screamed danger. The room was vast, impossibly vast, as if the dimensions themselves had warped. It was so much larger than the outside of the ship should have allowed. The walls curved outward, and in the center stood something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a heart. Not a human heart, but something far darker. It throbbed and pulsed with unnatural energy, a mass of glowing tendrils and dark veins, twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It looked like it was feeding off the ship itself, an obscene growth that anchored the entire structure to whatever nightmare dimension it had crawled from. And at the base of the heart, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was just another manifestation of the ship's twisted nature. But as I looked closer, I realized it was alive, or at least it had been. The figure was human, sort of. Its body was contorted, stretched, and twisted, its limbs elongated beyond the realm of reason. Its face was a grotesque parody of a human's, half missing, with just glowing eyes staring at us, devoid of any humanity. Its mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide for a normal person. This thing was a witness to whatever horror the ship had endured. It was its prisoner. The figure looked at us, its gaze intense and unnerving, as though it could see right through us. And then it spoke, its voice nothing like a human's. a low, guttural rasp, as though it was speaking from the depths of a grave. "You should not have come. You do not understand what you've awoken." My heart thudded in my chest as I took a step forward, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The tendrils of the heart seemed to reach toward the figure, connecting with it, feeding off it, as though it were a vessel. And the worst part? It was still alive. The eyes were still filled with something, some kind of twisted, broken consciousness. "What is this?" Juno asked, her voice shaky but defiant. "What is happening here?" The figure's head jerked toward her, the grin widening. It spoke again, its voice colder this time, sharper. "Your fate is already sealed. You have been chosen." I didn't know what to say. Chosen? For what? There was no way to know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But I could feel it, the pulse in the air, the heartbeat of the ship itself, as if it was waiting for us to take the next step, to choose how it would end for us. I had never believed in destiny, but right then, it felt like we were on the verge of something inevitable. Juno stepped forward, her expression hardened, trying to stand her ground despite the terror that gripped her. "I'm not afraid of you." But as the words left her mouth, something happened. The figure's grin faltered. It seemed to grow weaker for a moment, as if it were uncertain. Then it looked at the heart, its hollow eyes narrowing, as though understanding something we couldn't. It didn't speak again. Instead, it turned its gaze back to us, its mouth opening, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth that looked too sharp, too wrong to belong to a human. The tendrils from the heart began to writhe faster, violently, as though it were waking up. "You think you can stop it? You think you can end it?" the figure rasped, a final hollow laugh escaping from its mouth. "This ship, this place, it doesn't die. It feeds, it evolves. And now, it has you." Before I could react, the room shook again, harder this time. The pulsating veins on the walls burst open, releasing an energy so intense I felt it in my bones. The very air became thick with it, making it harder to breathe, like every molecule in the room was heavy with pressure. I could feel the tendrils of the heart reaching out toward us, as if sensing our presence, pulling us into its orbit. "Malik!" Juno shouted. She grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here, now!" I didn't need her to tell me twice. There was no room for hesitation. The creature was right. The ship wasn't going to just let us leave. The heart was feeding off our fear, off the very essence of us. It had been waiting for us all along, drawing us in with its pull, its hunger. We turned to flee, but the doors that had once opened for us now slammed shut, the sound echoing through the chamber. The walls vibrated with an inhuman hum, the ship's pulse growing louder and louder as we realized that escape was no longer an option. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a trap, a predator, and we were its prey. Something screeched from behind us. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The figure was moving, slowly at first, but then faster, with inhuman speed. It lurched toward us, its limbs twisting unnaturally, its body contorting like it was struggling to hold on to its own shape. It was no longer human. This was something else, something monstrous, something born from the ship itself. It lunged toward us, its mouth snapping open to reveal that impossible grin once again, as though it were anticipating our fear. Its eyes were burning with malice, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in them, a shadow, a shape, moving beneath the surface of its eyes. It was as if the ship was alive inside of it, controlling it, twisting it, using it. "Juno, run!" I yelled, but before we could make it even a step, the room shifted again. The walls warped, stretching outward like rubber, distorting reality around us. I had no idea what was happening, but I could feel the pressure, the weight of something ancient, malevolent, pressing in on us. The ship wasn't just a machine, it was a creature. It had fed off countless souls before us, and now it wanted ours. It wanted us to become part of its twisted, eternal existence. And the worst part? We weren't the first to be lured here. There were others like us. Lost souls trapped in the heart of this nightmare, their bodies twisted and repurposed, their consciousness subsumed into the ship's will. The creature had already taken them. We were just the next in line, Juno's voice cracked as she screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the ship's deafening hum. She reached for my hand, but the room was shifting too fast, and suddenly the floor dropped out from beneath us. I didn't have time to react. The last thing I remember was falling into darkness, and then nothing. The sensation of falling was suffocating. I couldn't tell if the floor had collapsed under us or if we had been thrown into the depths of the ship's twisted reality. Everything around me felt disorienting, like the walls of the world were closing in and stretching out at the same time. It was as though the ship itself was manipulating space, turning the laws of physics into some kind of cruel joke. Juno's scream was nothing more than a distant echo in my ears, her voice swallowed by the void. I reached for her, but my arms flailed uselessly in the darkness, my body weightless, caught in a downward spiral that felt like it would never end. The ship's hum, its heartbeat, was louder now, pounding in my head like an insistent drum. And the shadows, they were everywhere, crawling up my arms and legs, curling around my neck like a tightening noose. The weight of them pressed down on me, but I couldn't move, couldn't fight back. What was happening? I couldn't see. I couldn't think. It was as if my mind had been completely disconnected from reality, floating somewhere in the dark, a passenger in my own body. And then, with a sudden jolt, the world snapped back into focus. I slammed into something hard. The impact winded me, and I gasped for air, coughing as the darkness around me retreated. I was on solid ground, or at least what felt like solid ground, but the air was thick and stale, oppressive with a heaviness I couldn't explain. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I looked around, trying to make sense of where I was. The dim light, if you could even call it light, was coming from some unseen source, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. But I didn't recognize this place. The walls weren't made of metal. They were something else. A slick, smooth surface that seemed almost alive, shifting in rhythm with the pulse of the ship. It was warm here, uncomfortably so, and the air was thick with the scent of decay, like old, rotting meat. The walls themselves seemed to exhale, breathing in sync with the ship's heart. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the room, facing away from me. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its silhouette was humanoid, but something about it felt wrong. The shape was too smooth, too featureless. It was like a shadow given form. It wasn't human, I could tell that much, but it wasn't an alien either. It was something more sinister. It turned, and I froze. Its face was a void. No eyes, no mouth. Just a blank, black expanse where features should have been. A perfect, seamless blackness that seemed to draw everything into it. The creature didn't move. It didn't need to. The air around it rippled as though it were a hole in reality itself. It was as though the thing didn't belong here, that it had slipped through the cracks of space and time to exist in this strange, cursed place. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. It was as if the ship had already claimed me, had already tied my soul to this nightmare. Suddenly, a voice echoed in my head, not spoken, but felt. "You're too late." The words were like ice, cold and hollow, reverberating through my skull. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt as though it was speaking from somewhere deep inside the ship, like the voice of the ship itself. The figure moved, no, shifted. It didn't walk, it didn't run. It simply was somewhere else in the room. One moment it was across the room, and the next it was standing right in front of me. Its void of a face loomed inches from mine, its presence suffocating, like the gravity of the entire universe had just been compressed into this one moment. "You have no escape," the voice said again, and this time it was as though it came from inside my own head. It was the ship feeding into me, pulling at my mind. You can't be real," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't real." The figure tilted its head, its body shifting in a way that made my stomach churn. It didn't respond with words this time. Instead, the air around it seemed to grow even thicker, denser. A strange heat radiated from its form, suffocating, burning. I could feel it pushing into my chest, my lungs constricting as if the very air were being stolen from me. This place, this ship, is your prison now, the voice continued. You were always meant to be here. This is where you belong. I felt a sharp tug in my chest. It wasn't physical, not exactly, but it was as if something inside me was being pulled. A sensation that reminded me of a heartbeat, but wrong, out of sync, too fast, too erratic. The heart? You don't understand the heart, the voice whispered, the air around me vibrating with its words. It was alive once, a long time ago. But now it is nothing but a vessel, feeding, growing. It devours and consumes, and it will not stop. Not until it takes everything. I tried to turn away to look for Juno, but my body wouldn't obey. My eyes were locked on the figure, and no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I couldn't break free. I was trapped, physically, mentally, spiritually, caught in the ship's unyielding grip. And then, through the haze of panic and dread, a memory surfaced. Something I had almost forgotten. Juno. I didn't know where she was. I didn't know if she was alive, but I had to find her. I had to get her out of here. If there was any hope of surviving this, of escaping this nightmare, it was with her. The ship didn't care about me. It didn't care about us. But if we could find a way to break its grip, maybe there was a chance. My mind was racing now, thoughts colliding like a storm inside my skull. I didn't have time. Whatever was happening, whatever this place was, it was closing in on us. If I didn't move, if I didn't break free from the creature's hold, then we were already as good as dead. And then, as if reading my thoughts, the figure shifted again, its void-like face coming even closer. I could feel its presence pressing into me, and the suffocating darkness threatened to consume me entirely. It was no longer speaking in my mind, but in my soul. Its words echoed in every corner of my consciousness. There is no escape. The walls around me seemed to pulse, as though they were alive. The ship was feeding off my fear, and it was growing stronger. The creature's presence filled every inch of the room, and the pressure on my chest became unbearable. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned. My head swam. I thought I was going to pass out. But then, just as the darkness closed in completely, a voice broke through. Malik! Juno. Her voice, strained but clear, pierced the suffocating air, and for the first time since the fall, I felt a spark of hope. Malik, don't give up. Fight it. Somehow I found my body again. My limbs, stiff with fear, began to respond. I took a ragged breath, my chest heaving with the effort, and forced my gaze away from the figure. I had to move. I had to escape. But the creature, the ship, it wasn't going to let me go that easily. It screamed. The ship screamed. A guttural, ear-piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at once, reverberating through my bones. You cannot leave. I didn't have much time. I had to find her. I had to get out. The voice was a dark hum in my skull, vibrating in the depths of my mind like a malevolent presence. It was everywhere, slipping through my thoughts, coiling tighter and tighter, until it felt like I was drowning in its words. The ship. No, it wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a thing with purpose, with intent, and it didn't want us to leave. The air thickened again, a press of suffocating heat that made every breath feel like it would be my last. It wanted me, us, to stay, to be consumed. But I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let it take us. Juno's voice rang out again, desperate. Malik! It sliced through the chaos like a lifeline, pulling me from the brink of madness. I focused on that sound. I forced my mind to follow it, to fight through the crushing pressure of the ship, the force that sought to bind me here forever. With every ounce of strength I had, I pushed forward, moving toward her voice, toward the only thing that mattered now. The creature, whatever it was, didn't move, didn't need to. It was the source of the ship's power, and it loomed over me like a shadow stretching to swallow the light. It was impossible to escape, impossible to fight, but I had no choice. In the blur of my panicked thoughts, one thing became clear. I had to make a choice. There was no running, no second chance. If we stayed here, we would become part of it, become its fuel, its next chapter in an endless cycle of feeding. I pushed forward again, my body screaming with exhaustion. But there was no stopping. There was only the sound of Juno's voice, faint but steady. Her call was a thread I clung to, pulling me closer. I could see the dim shape of her now, just ahead, a flicker of movement against the oppressive darkness. She was alive. We could still escape, if we could only break free from the grip of the ship, from the thing that controlled it. But the floor shifted beneath me again, throwing me off balance. The ship wasn't letting go. The creature's presence pressed in, like an immovable weight tightening around me. "You cannot leave." The words were insistent, urgent, and chilling. I could feel them reverberating through my bones, sinking into my flesh, my mind, until they were part of me. The ship had claimed me, body and soul, and now it wanted to consume me completely. But Juno was still there. She hadn't given up, and neither would I. I stumbled, forcing myself upright despite the overwhelming pressure, fighting against the ship's pull, against everything it was trying to do to break me. I took one more step, then another, pushing forward with everything I had left. "I won't let you have me." The words barely formed in my mind, but they were enough. They were a spark in the suffocating dark, the last bit of defiance I had. And then, through the storm of thoughts, through the crushing weight of fear and dread, something inside me broke free. It wasn't physical, but it was real. A single, desperate surge of energy that shattered the ship's control over me, just enough to allow me to reach her. Juno was there, her form flickering like a mirage in the sea of darkness. She looked at me, her face a mixture of relief and fear, but there was something else in her eyes, determination. And in that moment, I knew. We weren't just fighting to survive. We were fighting to take back control, to wrestle free from the suffocating grip of whatever the ship had become. "We can do this," I whispered, more to myself than to her. But it was enough. Together, we took one last step forward, and the world went silent. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating in its stillness. It was as if the entire ship had exhaled, holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for us. The heavy hum that had filled the air, the oppressive pulse of the ship's unnatural heartbeat, was gone. There was nothing now but the sound of my own breathing and the soft scrape of our footsteps on the cold floor. Juno's hand was steady in mine, but I could feel the tremor in her grip, the uncertainty that lingered in the space between us. We didn't speak, didn't need to. There was no need for words. We both knew. This was it, the final stretch. Whatever happened next, we had reached the heart of it, the thing that had twisted this place into its grotesque form. The darkness around us was suffused with an eerie glow now. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, shifting and warping as though alive. There was no telling what this place was anymore, what it had become. The room stretched infinitely, or maybe it was just that the distance between us and the exit had blurred. The concept of time felt fluid here, like the ship had forgotten what it was supposed to be. But one thing was certain. This wasn't the ship we had boarded. This wasn't the vessel that had once been built to traverse the stars. It was something else. We moved cautiously, every step calculated, every noise amplified in the sudden stillness. The air was thick, laden with an odor that churned my stomach, a combination of burnt metal and decaying organic matter. The room around us grew warmer, uncomfortably so. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, but there was nothing to see. Nothing but the shifting shadows and the faint sense that something was moving, unseen, just beyond the edge of my perception. And then, the voice came again. "You cannot escape." It was a hiss that crawled into my ears like cold fingers, a whisper of dark thoughts threading into my mind. It wasn't the same as before. This time, it was clearer, sharper, colder. The ship itself was speaking, its words wrapped in malice, its intentions clear. It was trying to bend our minds to force us to turn around, to surrender. But this time, We stood firm. Juno squeezed my hand harder. I could see the determination in her eyes, though they were clouded by fear. She was as terrified as I was, but she was fighting it. She hadn't given up. "You belong to me now," the voice coiled through the air. "You are mine, forever." There was no escaping it. I could feel it in my bones, the ship's grip tightening around us. It was like the walls themselves were trying to close in, to squeeze the life from us. The temperature rose, the air thick with something that felt like a prelude to suffocation. The creature, the ship, was alive in a way that nothing should be. Alive in a way that was wrong. I could feel it, growing stronger, feeding on the terror that twisted in my gut. It was feeding off us, off our desperation, off the broken pieces of our minds. Every step forward felt heavier, the weight of it pulling us back, but we couldn't stop. We couldn't afford to. Juno's voice broke the silence. "We have to get to the core," she whispered urgently. "If we don't—" I know. I knew what she meant. The core was where the heart of the ship resided, the dark pulse that controlled it all. The heat had evaporated, leaving a strange chill in the air, and the strange, slick surface that had once covered every inch of the ship's interior had begun to peel away, leaving nothing but bare, cold metal beneath. And yet, there was no sound, no footsteps echoing in the vast, now empty expanse, no hum of energy, no creaking of decaying walls. The realization slowly sank in. We had won, or at least we had survived. But what did that really mean? The ship, the nightmare that had twisted reality itself, was over. But now there was nothing. The universe outside was silent. Still. I couldn't hear the faint hum of stars or the distant whisper of cosmic winds. There was no movement, no life. We had broken the heart of the ship, and in doing so, we had broken the connection to everything. I turned back toward Juno. She was still standing there, just as silent, staring into the void. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. She hadn't moved since the light. I called her name, but it was like my voice fell into an abyss. No echo, no response. She didn't even seem to hear me. It was as though she had become part of the silence, merged with it, the same way the ship had. The truth hit me then. We had defeated the ship, but it wasn't just the ship that had been destroyed. It had been something more, something that was now part of us. It had been feeding off us, growing in us, pulling us into its endless cycle of suffering and darkness. We had broken the ship, but in doing so, we had also broken ourselves. I moved toward her, hesitant at first, but I couldn't leave her there. Not like this. I reached out to her, but before I could touch her, she turned to face me. Her eyes, once filled with fear and determination, were now hollow, empty. She didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. I didn't understand it at first. But then, as I looked into the depth of her empty gaze, I realized that we weren't just survivors. We were the last remnants of something that had once been alive. The ship had consumed everything it could, and now it was finished. But it hadn't just consumed the ship. It had consumed us too. We weren't free. We were just forgotten, the last remnants of a nightmare that no longer had a place in the universe. And so we stood there, silent, together, alone. The story of the ship was over, but its echoes would never truly fade.